Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this 10th talk, we are now going to look at the 6th and the final part of our daily dua. The 6th part of our dua starts with the complete surah, which is known as Surah of Ikhlas. It is also known as Surah Tawheed. It is also known as the Surah of Purity, Sincerity. It has many names. It is a very short surah, and it has 4 verses, and it runs as Kul huwallahu ahad, Allahus samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. And the literal meaning of this is, say, Allah is one, the eternal. He is absolute, independent. He did not beget, nor was he begotten, and none is equal to him. It is very important for us to look at the context of the Quranic verses. And we have to remember that Islam followed Christianity. And by the time the Prophet was explaining and spreading the message of Islam, in the Middle East, there were strong Christian communities which believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. We have a very different view of things in Islam, and for this again I refer you to page 175 of Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah's memoirs, in which he says that Christianity lost its strength and meaning for Muslims in that it saw its great and glorious founder not as a man but as God incarnate in man, as God made flesh. And Maulana Hazar Imam, in a farman which is in the printed farman book called Precious Gems, Maulana Hazar Imam has explained that in Islam we do not ascribe physical attributes and physical relationships to God. He had explained to the Jamaat that this relationship of a father and a son is a physical relationship, and therefore we would not ascribe or attribute it to God. So for us, it is important then to understand Surah Ikhlas in the way we, particularly the Ismailis, in our batin and esoteric way of explanation, how do we understand this concept of Kul huwallahu ahad, Allahus samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. For this, I need to bring in the concept of monoreality. Monoreality is a concept which our 48th Imam, Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah Salawatullahi Alayhi, because of his time and status in the line of Imamat, gave to the world the concept of mono-reality, single reality, mono-reality. In fact, even the word mono-reality has been coined by our 48th Imam, because you will not find it in the dictionaries of the English language. And again we will take the help of Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah's chapter, in which on page 175 he says, after talking about Jesus, that the Christians believe that he was God made flesh. Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah continues, and I quote, "Thus there was an absolute need for the divine word's revelation to Muhammad himself, a man like the others, of God's person and of his relations to the universe which he had created. Once man has thus comprehended the essence of existence, there remains for him the duty, since he knows the absolute value of his own soul, of making for himself a direct path which will constantly lead his individual soul to and bind it with the universal soul, of which the universe, as much of it as we perceive with our limited vision, is one of the infinite manifestations. Thus, Islam's basic principle can only be defined as monorealism and not as monotheism. Consider, for example, the opening declaration of every Islamic prayer, Allahu Akbar. What does that mean? There can be no doubt that the second word of the declaration likens the character of Allah to a matrix which contains all and gives existence to the infinite, to space, to time, to the universe, to all active and passive forces imaginable, to life and to the soul. Imam Hassan has explained the Islamic doctrine of God and the universe by analogy with the sun and its reflection in the pool of a fountain. There is certainly a reflection or image of the sun, but with what poverty and with what little reality. How small and pale is the likeness between this impalpable image and the immense, blazing, white-hot glory of the celestial sphere itself. Allah is the sun, and the universe as we know it in all its magnitude and time with its power are nothing more than the reflection of the Absolute in the mirror of the fountain. This is a long quotation, and I would recommend that you, when you listen to this recording, please have the Memoirs chapter open in front of you on page 175 and follow this quotation and try to understand that here Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah alayhi salam is giving a higher, a more sublime concept than the belief of simply one God. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but first let us try to understand what Mola is saying here. What he is saying here is that everything in creation, everything which is in existence, and we, even though today we have very sophisticated microscopes and telescopes and electronic devices, we have the Hubble spacecraft which is taking photographs out in space, but even with the help of these instruments, whatever we can perceive is still very limited, because this monoreality has infinite manifestations, infinite, without end. And therefore, these infinite manifestations are like a matrix. Everything in which we know of, can see, and cannot see, everything is part of this monoreality. And what Mola is saying here by giving the example from Imam Hassan is that if you had a pool or a fountain or even a lake or a pond, then the sun which is up in the sky would be reflected in that water. But how pale and how unlike the reality would be that reflection. And what he is saying is that the Absolute, the monoreal, in its reality is extremely radiant. It is like the sun. One cannot look at it. One cannot look directly at the sun. It's a blazing white-hot glory. It's a celestial sphere. In the same way, this monoreality can be likened to the existence of the sun, but the infinite manifestations are simply reflections. So having said that, now let us try and understand this Surah Ikhlas in the Ismaili way of thinking. So, Kul huwallahu ahad. Say, O Muhammad, Allah is one or monoreal. Allahus Samad. Allah, the monoreal, in his physical and spiritual manifestations of his attributes, is everything. Lam yalid. He has not begotten. For the monoreal is an eternal and ever-pervading reality. Therefore, he does not need children. Children are needed by an existent which is mortal and cannot last forever. So, the monoreal does not give birth to another monoreal. Walam yulad, and he has not been begotten. For since the monoreal is eternal, he has always been there and he will last forever. Therefore, it is impossible to think that this monoreal has been created by anything prior to it. Walam yakullahu kufuwan ahad, and there is none equal to him. This monoreal, in his essential attributes, diverse manifestations, is extremely consummate and perfect. Just as in the analogy about the sun is so perfect, but the reflection of the sun in the pool is a pale reflection, a pale shadow compared to the original. Now, to understand monoreality at a more deep level, let's take the example of number 1. If we accept that all numbers are the manifestation of the number 1, then it is true to say that in the world of numbers, number 1 is everything. For there is no number which does not depend on number 1 for its existence. For instance, you can take a figure like a billion, but when you analyze it, these are 1 billion ones all put together. The essence is that it is an aggregate of the number 1. So when we count and we reckon, the number 1 in reality does not depend on any other number, nor has there been in reality any other number created from number 1, nor has the number 1 been created from any other number, nor is there any other number equal to number 1. For all numbers in reality are the different forms of number 1. Think carefully about this example of the number 1, and you will understand that this number 1 represents monoreality. And then all the numbers, odd, even, in tens, in hundreds, in thousands, in millions, in billions, in trillions, they are all the manifestation of the number 1. Another example from nature which might help us, because monoreality is a very sublime, a very exalted concept, then we should look at the example of water. On the planet Earth, we have water. Water is in the ocean, it's in the clouds, it's in the rain, it's in the springs and streams and lakes. It is in our human existence. More than 80% of our body is water. It's in vegetables, in the atmosphere, it's in the animals. But when you look at the attributes, the properties, the characteristics, the taste of water, they are all the same. So water is one reality, but it can manifest as a rock in the case of ice, blocks of ice, or it can manifest in the form of liquid, as it is in the oceans and the rivers and the lakes, or it can manifest as something invisible like vapor or water vapor. And so you can see that water is demonstrating what we in our Ismaili Tariqa call multiplicity like unity. So the unity is there, the essence of the water is the same, but the multiplicity is in its various manifestations. This is a good example. Another good example is that when you look at a seed, say let us take the acorn, which is the seed from which the oak tree grows. In the acorn, there is unity, complete unity. It is one substance. But when you plant this acorn in the ground and then it grows into an oak tree, then the oak tree is full of multiplicity, because the oak tree will have roots, it will have trunk, it will have bark, it will have branches, it will have leaves, and finally the fruit from which the acorn seed is produced again. And in this example, as in the water example, this multiplicity like unity is also a circle. And the circle, as we have said many times during these explanations, is a very good example of eternity or infinity. No beginning, no end. So this is the way we should try to understand mono-reality. Now, I said earlier that since Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah mentions monotheism and makes the statement that in Islam, the basic principle can only be defined as monorealism and not as monotheism, perhaps we should try to understand that in the development of the human race, in the evolution of religion, human beings have gone through and are still going through several stages of intellectual understanding. So let's discuss this further. That we have heard that throughout history and even in our present context, there may be people who are totally self-centered. In other words, they worship their own egos. In the Quran, there are two examples. These examples are the example of Pharaoh in the time of Hazrat Moses and of Nimrud in the time of Hazrat Abraham. That these two kings were condemned by the Quran because they used to go around saying that they themselves were God. And they were so full of ego that they were not ready to be humble, to give into, to submit to anything other than themselves. This type of total self-concentration is called ego worship, and that's the lowest level of human beings' evolution. But as human beings develop their intellectual understanding, they begin to realize that there is something beyond them. And when they realize that there is something beyond them, then in the initial stages they make statues and they have carvings. And if you look throughout the history of the world and human beings' understanding, then you will find the concept of idolatry. Now, idolatry in itself is not very good, because here there is the concept of many gods. As we know, for instance, in pre-Islamic Arabia, they used to have 360 gods in the Kaaba, which they considered to be superior to them. The good thing was that, yes, they felt that they themselves were inferior to the gods, so they were humble and they were submitting to the gods. But at the same time, the disadvantage of idolatry is that a human being's attention is disseminated into many, many gods. There is no focus. Then as human beings develop, as in the case of Arabia, they were blessed with the Holy Prophet Muhammad. The Holy Prophet Muhammad brought the concept of belief in one God. And this belief in one God is shared by all the Ahl al-Kitab, or the people of the book, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. We all say that yes, there is one God, or monotheism. But even in this concept of monotheism, there is a feeling that God is somewhere else and we are where we are. So there is a separation between the creatures and God. In other words, there is almost duality, that these are two separate things. But then Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah, Salawatullahi alayhi, our 48 great Imam, whom Maulana Hazar Imam in a farman in July 1957 in London has described as the finest Imam we have ever had. He gave this sublime teaching of mono-reality. And in mono-reality, there is no duality. There is no separation. All of us, everything in the creation, everything in God's creation is part of this mono-reality. We are all manifestations of the same one reality. Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah later on in his chapter describes this in the context of the doctrine of soul. He says, Islamic doctrine goes further than the other great religions, for it proclaims the presence of the soul, perhaps minute, but nevertheless existing in an embryonic state in all existence, in matter, in animals, trees, and space itself. Every individual, every molecule, every atom has its own spiritual relationship with the all-powerful soul of God. But men and women, being more highly developed, are immensely more advanced than the infinite number of other beings known to us. Islam acknowledges the existence of angels, of great souls who have developed themselves to the highest possible planes of the human soul and higher, and who are centers of the forces which are scattered throughout the universe. End of quotation. So what do we believe as Ismailis, particularly since the ta'aleem of Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah is that we, all of us, everything which we see around us is a manifestation of that same mono-reality, but the manifestations are on different levels. And the human being is on this highest level from where he can go even higher, that he can become, he can traverse all the planes of the human soul and higher and become centers of forces scattered in the universe. This is the beauty of the Ismaili teachings, that we are told that we have huge potential within ourselves. Earlier we talked about Rabbil Alameen, and at that time we understood that we are the personal worlds. The whole of the macrocosm is in us, and this microcosm has the capacity to develop and develop and develop to the ultimate, which is why Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah alayhi salam in his chapter also says that we should try to see that the divine spark which is in each one of us is not extinguished. Rather, it is developed to that full companionship on high, which is called Rafiki A'la. Companionship on high is when a human being passes through all the stages of religion, follows the guidance of the Imam perfectly, and with the help of the Imam's ta'lim attains spiritual enlightenment and vision, and at that time that human being merges in the mono-reality. This is Ismaili teaching, and this Ismaili teaching is in the sixth part, which is the final part of our dua, and our dua, sixth part starts with this concept of mono-reality, because this dua for us contains all the messages of Ismaili ta'aleem. Ya Ali Madad.